I worked with my hands for 38 years. Poured concrete, laid rebar, climbed scaffolding in temperatures that would make most people turn around and go home. My knuckles are permanently scarred from a job site accident back in 2003, and I've got a knee that swells up every winter like it's trying to remind me of the fall I took off a second-story frame in Cincinnati. None of that ever bothered me. Work was work. You showed up, you did it right. You went home tired and slept clean. What bothered me was standing in my own daughter's kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, holding a casserole dish my wife had spent 2 hours making, and hearing my son-in-law say, loud enough for the neighbors to hear through the open window, "We don't need your charity." My daughter, Nora, didn't say a word. She just stood there by the refrigerator, arms crossed, looking at the floor. That was the day I understood something I'd been refusing to see for almost 3 years. Let me back up. My name is Frank. I'm 61 years old. I spent most of my adult life in the trades. Started as a laborer at 23, got my foreman certification at 30, and eventually built a small excavation company out of a beat-up pickup truck and a used backhoe I bought at auction. Nothing glamorous. But it was mine. By the time I turned 55, I had 17 employees, contracts with 3 county municipalities, and a decent reputation in the region. I drove a Ford F-250 with a cracked dashboard and kept my money in a credit union account like I always had, because that's just how I was raised. My wife, Helen, passed from ovarian cancer 7 years ago. I won't spend too long there because that grief still doesn't have a bottom. But she was the kind of woman who made Sunday dinner feel like a holiday and who wrote birthday cards 2 weeks early so she'd never miss one. She loved our daughter more than anything on this earth. And she made me promise before she was gone that I would always be there for Nora. I kept that promise. Even when it cost me. Nora was 34 when her maternal grandmother, Helen's mother, passed away and left behind an estate that surprised everyone, including me. Edna had been a quiet, careful woman who had lived in the same house in rural Ohio for 50 years, driven the same car for 12, and clipped grocery coupons until the week she died. What none of us knew was that her late husband, Leonard, had quietly invested in farmland across 3 counties starting in the 1970s. By the time Edna passed, that land had appreciated into something that made the estate attorney clear his throat twice before saying the number out loud. Nora received $4.1 million. Her brother, my son Daniel, who lives in Portland and called me the morning after he heard, said, "Dad, please be careful." He knew Nora. He'd watched the same things I had. The subtle comments over the years about my truck, my clothes, the way I talked. She'd married a man named Cole who worked in commercial real estate and had opinions about everything and respect for almost nothing. Daniel had stopped going to family dinners 2 years before Edna passed because he said being around Cole made him feel like he was being audited. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. That's what fathers do. The first few months after the inheritance, things were fine. Nora called, we talked. She seemed happy. She and Cole bought a house in a newer subdivision outside Columbus. Big place. 5 bedrooms, a 3-car garage, the kind of home where everything is beige and nothing looks lived in. I drove up to see it in October. She showed me around. Cole shook my hand but spent most of the visit on his phone. I noticed the way he looked at my truck when I pulled in. Just a flicker of something. But I noticed. Things started to shift around Thanksgiving. She called to say they were going to Cole's parents' place in Scottsdale for the holiday. That was fine. Families do that. But then Christmas came and went with a card and a gift card to a home improvement store, which felt pointed, like she was suggesting I needed fixing up. Daniel came to stay with me that Christmas, and we ate Chinese takeout and watched football. And it was honestly one of the better holidays I'd had in a while. But I missed her. By February, her calls got shorter. By March, they stopped unless I initiated them. I started to notice the pattern. I'd text, she'd reply 4 hours later. I'd ask to visit, she'd say they were busy. I'd offer to help with anything around the new house, and Cole would appear from nowhere in the conversation to say they had people for that. I was 60 years old and had built houses from the ground up, but apparently I wasn't the right kind of help. Then came the Sunday with the casserole. Helen had a recipe for chicken and wild rice that Nora had loved since she was 7 years old. I'd learned to make it after Helen passed, partly because I needed something to do with my hands in those first months, and partly because it made the house smell like her. I drove 40 minutes to bring it to Nora and Cole on a Sunday afternoon, just to do something, to show up, the way you do when you love someone. Cole opened the door before I could knock. I think he'd seen me pull in. "We don't need your charity," he said. I looked past him. Nora was in the kitchen. She heard it. She didn't move. I set the casserole dish on the porch railing and drove home. I didn't cry until I was back on the highway. Then I did for about 10 minutes, and then I stopped, because I had things to figure out. I called Daniel that night. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always loved about him. When I finished, he said, "Dad, she's not going to change until something changes for her. I'm sorry." Then he asked how I was doing, and we talked for another hour about nothing important, and I felt a little less alone. What happened next, I didn't plan. It just unfolded. My company, RKB Excavation, which I built starting in 1998, had grown in ways I haven't really sat down and totaled up in a while. The municipal contracts were steady. A regional development group had approached me 2 years prior about a partnership, and I'd taken a minority stake in their operation in exchange for our continued service relationship. That stake had quietly grown. I also owned the land where my main equipment yard sat, 7 acres on a county road that had appreciated significantly as the area developed, and I'd purchased 2 smaller parcels in the same corridor years before as a buffer. I didn't buy them as investments exactly. I bought them because I wanted control of my own borders. But land in that corridor was now worth something serious. I hadn't told Nora any of this. Not out of secrecy exactly. It just never came up. I drove an old truck, lived in the house I'd bought with Helen in 1994, and didn't talk about money because that's not how I was raised. My father worked at a mill for 30 years and never once told anyone what he made. That was private. That was yours. So when my accountant, a quiet man named Gerald who has done my books for 20 years, sat me down in April and walked me through a full valuation, I was looking at something I genuinely hadn't expected to see written in one place. Net worth, approximately $8.3 million, between the company equity, the land parcels, the development stake, and a retirement portfolio I'd been funding since my late 30s. I was, by any reasonable definition, wealthy. Not flashy wealthy, not Scottsdale wealthy, but real, durable wealthy, the kind that doesn't disappear when markets shift because it's tied to things in the ground. Gerald looked at me across his desk and said, "Frank, you should probably talk to an estate attorney." I did. Her name was Patricia, and she was sharp and direct and didn't waste anyone's time. We set up a trust structure over several weeks. The trust would govern how my assets transferred when and under what terms. I had specific language drafted, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I had watched what money without accountability had done to my daughter's judgment, and I wasn't going to let it happen twice. The trust included Daniel as primary beneficiary. It included a charitable component directed toward a skilled trade scholarship fund at the technical college where I'd gotten my foreman certification, something that felt right. And it included a conditional provision for Nora. The provision was simple: if she and I had a documented, verified relationship at the time of my death, meaning consistent contact, shared holidays, real presence in each other's lives, she would receive an equal share to Daniel. If not, her portion would redirect to the scholarship fund. I didn't tell her. I wasn't trying to threaten her. I was just, for the first time in a long time, taking care of myself. The trigger came that summer. Cole's company had apparently overextended on a commercial project and was facing serious cash flow problems. I heard about it secondhand. A contractor I knew had worked on one of Cole's projects and mentioned it at a job site. I didn't go looking for the information. It just found me the way information does in the trades, where everyone knows everyone. Nora called me in July. First time she'd called me without me calling. First in 4 months. Her voice was different, lighter, like she was trying to sound casual when she wasn't. We talked for a few minutes about nothing, and then she mentioned she and Cole were thinking about a renovation on the house, and asked if I had any thoughts. I said I had some experience with that, sure. She laughed. It was the first genuine laugh I'd heard from her in a long time. We talked for 40 minutes. She mentioned Cole was dealing with some stress at work. I said that happened to everyone. I didn't push. Over the following weeks, she called more. Then she started driving up on Saturdays. Just her, not Cole. She'd bring coffee, and we'd sit on the back porch the way we used to when she was in high school. And she'd talk, and I'd mostly listen, and sometimes she'd notice something around the house that needed fixing, and she'd say, "Dad, you should let me help with that." And I'd say I was fine, and she'd do it anyway. It felt like getting my daughter back. I want to be honest here. I didn't ask her what changed. I didn't make her explain herself. We didn't have a big confrontation where she apologized and I forgave her, and we both cried and learned something. Life isn't usually that clean. What I did do, one afternoon in September when she was helping me clear out the garage, was say, quietly, not looking at her, "You know your mother would have wanted this." Nora stopped what she was doing. She stood there for a moment with a cardboard box in her hands, and then she said, "I know, Dad. I know." That was enough. Cole I never fully warmed to, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But something had clearly shifted in their dynamic. He was quieter when I saw him, less performative. He shook my hand differently. Not the quick, dismissive pump from before, but a real handshake with eye contact. I don't know what happened between them. I didn't ask. But a man who's been humbled by something. Business, failure, his own choices. Often comes out of it a little more human. By Thanksgiving that year, Nora and Cole were at my house. Daniel drove in from Portland. It was the first time all 3 of us had been in the same room in 6 years. Helen's sister came up from Kentucky, and my neighbor Earl brought pie because he always does, and nobody ever tells him to stop. We ate at the same table where Helen and I had eaten almost every meal for 20 years, and Nora sat in the chair that had been her mother's, and nobody pointed that out. But I think we all felt it. After dinner, while Cole and Daniel were doing the dishes, which I still can't fully believe happened, Nora and I sat on the back porch with our coffee. It was cold enough that we could see our breath. She had on one of Helen's old cardigans she'd taken from the house years ago. She said, "Dad, I want to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Were you ever angry? I mean really angry? When Cole said that to you at the door, did you ever want to just—" She trailed off. I thought about it. For a little while I said, "But anger takes energy, and I decided I wanted to use mine for other things." She nodded. She was quiet for a minute. Then she said, "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. But I am." I told her it was enough. Because it was. Here's what I didn't tell her that night, and what I'm going to be honest about now. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I'd had a follow-up meeting with Patricia, my estate attorney. She had reviewed the trust language and asked me if I wanted to make any modifications. I told her yes. I told her to remove the conditional provision for Nora. Not because I was certain of everything, I wasn't. But because my daughter, sitting on the back porch in her mother's cardigan, asking me if I'd been angry, was worth something that a legal document couldn't capture. The provision being there had never been about punishing her. It had been about protecting myself and about clarity, knowing that if she never came back around, I wouldn't spend my remaining years chasing something that wasn't going to happen. But she did come back, and Patricia, who had seen a lot of family situations in her career, nodded when I told her and said, "That's the right call." I also told Patricia to increase the scholarship fund regardless. We went from a $200,000 endowment to $500,000. That part I didn't change. Daniel called me the week after Thanksgiving, as he always does when he gets back to Portland. He thanked me for the holiday. I told him it had been the best one in a while. He agreed. Then he said, "Did you know Cole spent most of the dish's conversation asking me questions about you, like genuinely curious questions, how you built the company, what it was like starting out?" I said, "No, I didn't know that." Daniel said, "He seemed like a different person. People can change. I've lived long enough to believe that, though I've also lived long enough to know it's not guaranteed, and it's not your job to wait forever." The difference is knowing which situation you're in. I'm not telling this story because I have it all figured out. I don't. I'm telling it because I spent 4 decades learning that the most important things you build aren't made of concrete or steel. They take longer. They require more patience. And sometimes they come apart, and you have to figure out if what you're looking at is worth rebuilding or worth letting go. With Nora, it was worth rebuilding. There's a photograph on my kitchen windowsill. It's been there for years, so long I stop seeing it sometimes. It's from a camping trip we took when Nora was 11. Helen's in it, laughing at something off camera. Nora's leaning against a pine tree, squinting into the sun. Already a little too cool for camping, but trying not to show it. I'm in the background, barely in frame, probably checking a tent stake or something completely unglamorous. After Thanksgiving, I noticed Nora had stopped and looked at it, just for a moment, when she thought no one was watching. I know what she was looking at. I let her look. I'll leave the rest alone. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be true, and after 61 years, I've learned that the quiet moments, the ones where nobody says anything and everybody understands, those are the ones that last. The casserole dish is still on my counter. I used it last Sunday. Made the chicken and wild rice the same way Helen taught me. Nora came over with the kids. I didn't mention she has 2, a girl and a boy, 7 and 4, and we ate together, and her daughter kept asking me to tell her a story, and I made one up about a construction worker who found buried treasure under a parking lot in Cleveland, which made everyone laugh. After they left, I washed the dish and set it on the drying rack and stood in the kitchen for a minute, just standing in it. It was enough. It was more than enough. I've been turning this over in my mind for a while now, trying to figure out what the real lesson is. Not the easy version. Not the one where the bad guy loses and the good guy wins and everybody learns something clean. Real life doesn't hand you that. What it hands you is messier and slower and, if you're paying attention, more interesting. What I keep coming back to is this. The way you treat people when you think it costs you nothing tells everyone exactly who you are. Cole stood in that doorway and said what he said, because he thought I was just a man with rough hands and an old truck. He thought the calculus was simple. He was wrong, but not for the reason most people would assume. He wasn't wrong because I had $8.3 million sitting in a trust. He was wrong because no version of that moment, rich or broke, was going to end well for him. You can't build a life on contempt and expect the foundation to hold. That's the part about consequences that people miss. They think consequences are dramatic, a courtroom, a confrontation, a number said out loud in a lawyer's office. But most of the time, consequences are quiet. They're the slowly narrowing circle of people who genuinely want to be around you. They're the holidays that get smaller. They're the moment your wife starts driving up alone on Saturdays because she's finally allowing herself to miss her father. Nora came back around. I'm grateful for that every single day, but I also know, and I told myself this honestly, in the months when the calls had stopped, that I had to be willing to let her not come back. That's the hard version of integrity. It's not just doing the right thing when people are watching. It's deciding who you are when nobody is, including your own daughter. I kept showing up. I kept my word to Helen. I drove 40 minutes with a casserole dish, and I didn't make anyone feel ashamed about what happened next, because shame wasn't going to build anything. The trust document, the provisions, the meeting with Patricia, none of that was revenge. I want to be clear about that. It was clarity. There's a difference. Revenge is about making someone else feel something. Clarity is about knowing what you're willing to live with. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my years chasing a relationship that had decided I wasn't worth the trouble. But I also wasn't going to close the door. I left it open. I just stopped standing in the cold, waiting for someone to walk through it. What came back to me, and I think this matters, was built on something real. Not on what I had in the bank. Not on Cole's business hitting a wall, on Nora sitting on the back porch in her mother's cardigan, asking me quietly if I'd been angry. That question took something. It took honesty and a little bit of courage, and the willingness to look at yourself and not look away. I respect that. I always will. I'm 61 years old. I've poured concrete in July and climbed scaffolding in February, and I've buried the person I loved most in this world. I know what hard is, and I know that the hardest thing isn't any of that. The hardest thing is staying decent when decency isn't being returned to you. Keeping your hands open when every instinct says close them. Continuing to be the kind of man your children can eventually come home to. That's the work. It doesn't have a time frame. It doesn't come with a guarantee. But if you do it long enough, and you do it honestly, without bitterness eating you hollow, something usually finds its way back. It found its way back to me.